Is there anything you would have done differently?
We reported a true story.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq.
Controversial Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and questions about Kavanaugh's drinking in the past.
Sean Hannity, come on up, Sean Hannity.
Today, Andrew Cuomo is having a moment.
Ho, ho, ho. I am Chris Darwalt, here alone, lonesome without Eliana Johnson, and welcome to Ink-Stained Wretches, where we break down what's going wrong and what's going right with the American news media. And we did it again, America. We had a whole year. We even had an election. We did a bunch of stuff. We were very busy, and America was getting on drugs, getting off drugs, was feeling vibes, was not feeling vibes. It's been a lot, and it's been a minute. But fortunately, we have a delightful way for you to recap the year that was, with a greatest hits of Ink-Stained Wretches, put together by the intrepid Colin Chicola, as we walk you back through the year that was and some of our favorite, funniest moments. And I guarantee you, though I have not heard what Colin will select, that there will be lots of gross, weird food content because I am obsessed. Nikki Haley is the candidate of last resort. Nikki Haley is for people who don't want Donald Trump to be the nominee. And that comes with trade-offs, right? Because people aren't saying, I am so excited, or very few people are saying, I am so excited to vote for Nikki Haley. What they are saying is, we got to do something. And the people in New Hampshire, as embodied in the person of Chris Sununu, the governor, are saying, we got to draw a line in the sand here. We've got to do something about Trump. And we were talking about this before we started recording, but I think it bears repeating. Conservatives and moderate Republicans are accustomed to fighting against insurgencies, right? George W. Bush facing John McCain, Pat Buchanan, Rick Santorum, Mike Huckabee, Herman Cain. We can go down the list of insurgents coming against mainstream Republicans. Well, now mainstream Republicans are a minority in their party, and they've got to start thinking like insurgents. And the way you have to do that is the same way people who backed Rick Santorum, evangelical Protestants in Iowa, who were like, Rick Santorum's not exactly my cup of tea, but I think he's probably our best shot to cause heartache for Mitt Romney. That's the kind of thinking that will be required of Nikki Haley's supporters.
Which brings us to the Haley-DeSantis face-off.
Oof.
I really did not think that either of these candidates came out looking good or had a moment. I thought it was a diminishing, and I think a lot of people, including me, had really wanted to see just the two of them on a stage and to see them face off. And first of all, I didn't think it was particularly substantive. Haley went over and over again to DeSantisLies.com, not particularly substantive. And
right.
I felt like they looked small.
I think they're going to go again, right? The two of them are slated to debate again, right?
They are, but not before Iowa.
But before New Hampshire.
Before New Hampshire.
So I think...
So this was the last face-off before Iowa on Monday.
I think Haley, as much as we saw in the debate that you moderated, in the second half of that debate, she brought a similar energy here, which is playing a prevent defense. And she did not... I believe that Haley, stung by the criticisms and the feeling that she was not robust enough in the News Nation debate, that she came ready to just attack, that it would not be said that she was unwilling to attack DeSantis. What I'll be interested to see, and this is what I love about this time of the year, and this is what I love about my job. A week from now, when I'm back from Iowa and we're recording this, the world will look totally different, because if DeSantis has some great showing in Iowa and surprises and for level setting purposes, let me just say, a decisive victory for Donald Trump is he gets more than half of the vote, right? I
agree with that, over 50%.
If he gets over 50% of the vote and he's rolling, then that's good for him and status quo. Then the question is, okay, what is a loss look like? Or
I was
what's,
just
what's
about to go there.
What's a bad outcome? And I think for him, a bad outcome is like 40% or 30.
I was going to say something in the 30s.
Oh, if he cards
Something
in
in
the
the 30s.
if he cards in the 30s, that's a big problem, right? And that speaks to, and not to turn this into a politics podcast because it's in the news about the news, but I will say those shockingly cold forecasts. If you're the front runner, that's a problem because people don't feel like, because remember, to caucus at 1,600 locations around the state, it takes 2 or 3 hours. To caucus is already a big demand instead of just going to vote. But
the caucuses are so interesting because you show up at a church and it's there are 40 people there, 40 to 70 people or so, and you listen to people give speeches on behalf of the candidates. You don't just go, cast a ballot. It's very, and the number of caucus goers is so small for the outsized attention that Iowa gets. It's a tiny number of people who are actually casting these ballots.
And I love it, and I love the Iowans because they do take it seriously and it is important. But severe weather will dampen turnout, and Trump has 2 problems there. One, as the front runner, well, he doesn't need me. He's way ahead. I'm not gonna turn out. And then number 2, his voters are not Donald Trump's coalition relies on lower propensity voters than Nikki Haley and others because there's a potent correlation between education and income and voter propensity. The richer you are and the better educated you are, generally speaking, the more likely you are to vote. And and
those are Haley voters.
Those are Haley voters. And so we'll be looking very much at the Des Moines metro area and the Cedar Rapids area. So Trump will dominate in the West, and then Haley and DeSantis will fight it out in Des Moines in the East.
There was an amazing New York Times piece, headline, "This Again in Frozen Iowa, the press corps ponders a slog of a campaign. Snowstorms, a thinning field of candidates, and Donald Trump's polling lead contributed to a smaller media turnout for the nation's first caucus because, of course, it was absolutely freezing in Iowa." And so the Times writes, the number of credentialed journalists fell to 1,200 from 2,600 4 years ago. Some big-name TV stars stayed home. The lobby bar of the Des Moines Marriott downtown, once a buzzing, gossip-soaked node of Washington and Manhattan-based reporters, anchors, and operatives, was a ghost town late Saturday. The attenuated vibe was best summed up by a T-shirt on sale in the hotel gift shop. Election 2024. Welp, I guess we're doing this again. The conceit of this piece, that basically you should only do your job if it's fun, was so amusing to me.
I want to be measured and cautious here, because nobody cares about my whatever. As I used to say, I'm not working in a coal mine and I'm not in Afghanistan. I know people who I grew up with and around who had to do both. And this is an easy job. The low turnout, I did a survey of journalists in Iowa.
So let's just tell people it's down to 120,000 in 2024 from 170,000.
Did they get to 120,000?
I think it was, yes, I believe it was.
Nate Moore, what's the answer?
You want to double check?
We want the final numbers because this matters for my bets. But the
check me, Nate.
110. Now I assume they haven't all been counted yet.
Thank you, Nate, for the live fact check.
But the turnout in 2016 was
170.
Yeah, higher than that. So this returned to where it used to be for Republicans, much lower. And that was the norm. 2008, 2012, in 2000, it was like under 100,000, or it was about 100,000 or whatever. But anyway, there's reasons for that. They include the weather, but it's not just the weather. And I think this piece, there's the the self-regard, the dripping self-regard of the piece, some of it tongue-in-cheek, is a little goofy, but it's a scene piece. But I think for the political turnout and the media turnout, it's not just that it was cold. It's that there wasn't much going on, right? I wanted a race.
The results were sort of foreordained.
Yeah, I wanted a race. I always want a race. I want a race to cover. I don't think Republicans wanted a race. I don't think they were interested. And turnout was low, but not crazy. And the weather was a depressant, but so was the fact that, and look, I don't think the Democrats are ever coming back to Iowa. Part of what the unanchored statistic in this piece about the number of credentialed journalists is what was going on. There was a Democratic contest too, right? There was an open Democratic seat, and in 2016 there were both, right? Both parties had open seats, and there was all this attention. The Democrats have left Iowa. They're not coming back. I think what happens with Iowa is this. It's a good place for insurgents to try to get a foothold. The largest ever turnout for Iowa caucuses were Democrats in 2008 because Barack Obama saw in a neighboring state, he saw an opportunity and he went all in on Iowa, and it became a whole sensation as Hillary Clinton and John Edwards tried to battle it back and blah, 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 blah. Maybe something like that happens again in the future, but I don't think there's much sizzle.
We have a good piece in The Atlantic by McKay Coppins.
Yep.
Why attacks on Trump's mental acuity don't land.
And McKay Coppins, writing in The Atlantic, he retells the story of his famous/infamous piece that he wrote about Donald Trump in the 2016 cycle, where he had been granted an interview with Trump in New Hampshire, and the schedule got changed, and Trump took McKay Coppins to Mar-a-Lago instead. And Coppins flew down and then wrote a biting piece about his time with Trump. And to Coppins' credit, said, I got a lot of it right. The one thing I got wrong was saying that Donald Trump will never really run. He's not really going to do this. And was it 2016? It may have even been 2012. 2014. Okay, so it was in between. So he said, Trump's never going to run, but here's the story of Donald Trump. And Coppins was prescient, right? He was right about a lot of the things that have become very normal about Trump. And the point that he's making here is a very good one. As Democrats say, oh, yeah, well, Biden is senile. Well, so's Trump. Look at Trump, his mental acuity, blah, 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 blah. Donald Trump has been preposterous.
And by the way, some of Trump's Republican rivals made these attacks as well. DeSantis had a whole Twitter thread that had videos of Trump's verbal flubs. It was something we asked about in the debate.
Yep.
And Nikki Haley has said, we need to have acuity tests, mental tests for politicians, for both candidates.
She lumps them together and calls them both 80-year-olds.
Exactly.
But the moment for me when I realized that Trump was being held to a different standard by the electorate and the media was, who Carl Icahn was?
Of course.
Okay. So most Americans don't know who Carl Icahn was, especially at an outdoor Trump rally at a football stadium in Mobile, Alabama. But Trump was doing a rally in Mobile, Alabama, and he's talking, and he starts riffing on something Carl Icahn told him. Carl Icahn, of course, one of the merger kings of the 1970s and 1980s, most famous/infamous for the TWA takeover, which was sort of the template for the movie Wall Street, where they buy the airline, strip it for parts, and blah, 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 blah.
He also had a high-profile throwdown with Bill Ackman over Herbalife and whether Herbalife was a pyramid scheme that he was victorious in.
As Trump is riffing and talking and he gets to Carl Icahn, I thought, boy, talk about read the room. What do a bunch of concert kind of going with a monster truck rally energy at this Alabama stadium want to hear about Carl Icahn. They didn't care. They applauded. They cheered because Trump is like performance art. It's the Jackson Pollock nature of Trump's logorrhea is there's enough in it that you can always, if you want to like him and you want to agree with him, he'll just talk until he says something that you're like, okay, that. I don't know who Carl Icahn is, but I like the thing he said about rapists and murderers from Mexico. And moving on.
Coppins writes, there's a simple reason coverage of verbal flubs, memory lapses, and general octogenarian confusion is more damaging to Biden than it is to Trump. Biden ran for president on a platform of stability and competence, and that image is undermined by suggestions of mental decline.
Word.
Accusing Trump of going crazy doesn't work because, well, he has sounded crazy for a long time. The people who voted for him don't seem to mind. In fact, it's part of the appeal. I would also add they're two different things, crazy and mental decline. And when you're talking about mental acuity and mental decline and a race for president that's between two parties and you're naturally comparing the two, it is obvious that Biden is suffering from mental decline more than Trump is.
Well, if the question is who is a more dangerous person to have as president, which is basically the narrative that is set up by both, right? What both parties are leaning into is the idea of, yes, it would be dangerous for this person to be president, but it would be more dangerous for the other person to be president. And if I was a Democrat, I would not be comfortable in getting into a race to the bottom with Donald Trump, because that is that's his milieu. That's where he operates. That's where he thrives.
The meltdown at NBC News over the 48-hour hiring and firing of former RNC chairwoman of
5 days, not even a half a Scaramucci.
Ronna Romney McDaniel as a correspondent.
Or a contributor.
A contributor at a reported salary of $300,000 a year.
So should we begin with listening to Chuck Todd's moment of righteous indignation?
Let's say first that this was announced in a note to NBC on last Friday, and then McDaniel was a guest on Meet the Press on Sunday, where she was interviewed by Kristen Welker, the host of Meet the Press.
Chuck Todd's replacement.
It was and then it was followed by a panel on which Chuck Todd was a guest, and he had this to say.
Let me deal with the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
I think our bosses owe you an apology for putting you in this situation, because I don't know what to believe. She is now a paid contributor by NBC News. So I have no idea whether any answer she gave to you was because she didn't want to mess up her contract. She wants us to believe that she was speaking for the RNC when the RNC was paying for her. So she has credibility issues that she still has to deal with.
Yeah.
Is she speaking for herself, or is she speaking on behalf of who's paying her? Once at the RNC, she did say that, hey, I'm speaking for the party. I get that. That's part of the job. So what about here?
Todd's complaint was that Romney McDaniel had suborned Donald Trump's lies about the election and had soft-soaped the claims about January 6th being an inside job or whatever, that she had mouthed or looked the other way on these claims. But then when Welker asked her about these things, she said, no, I think that that's wrong and I think they should be punished for it. And then asked why, she said, well, because that's what your job is when
She said you got to take one for the team.
Yeah, that's what your job is.
I have a couple of thoughts on this, and I'm curious what you think. The first is that surely if NBC News, which hired Ronna Romney McDaniels, and ABC News, I believe, has Reince Priebus on the payroll. Okay. It's frustrating to me as somebody on the right that these are the go-to spokesmen for the right. My first thought was surely they could have found a more articulate, better spokeswoman for the cause than she.
Right.
And that part is frustrating to me, and part of me wonders, do they look for people who are not the most articulate spokesman for the cause. And the other part of it is, of course, Chuck Todd opened the floodgates and all of these people came out.
The whole MSNBC universe, Joe Scarborough, by the way, who was hired in exactly the same fashion that Ronna Romney McDaniel was when he was a former Republican congressman, Gingrich revolutionary congressman from Florida, was hired in exactly the same manner, trying to add Republican voices at NBC. He got up on his hind legs and Rachel Maddow, and I think it was in Playbook. I'm sorry if I'm mistaken about this, but at one point there was even a catalog of who on MSNBC has spoken out about it and who has not. And then it listed too. It was like Lawrence O'Donnell and so. Over to you. Like, okay, this is the signal now for everyone to
pile on.
Now, some useful backstory here.
Can I?
You can do anything
before you do
want.
The backstory. The most insane one of these was definitely, and we have to play the clip of Nicole Wallace saying, "How could NBC turn over our sacred airwaves and give her? She's now a card-carrying member of the NBC family." And oh my gosh, I mean.
And who's Nicole Wallace?
Nicole Wallace, the former Bush administration spokeswoman. I mean, the arrogant self-regard is so nauseating. Give me a break.
Here it is.
What we've also said to election deniers is not just they can do that on our airwaves, but that they can do that as one of us, as badge-carrying employees of NBC News, as paid contributors to our sacred airwaves.
Okay, so what Nicole Wallace is saying is the same thing Joe Scarborough is saying, which is it's fine to hire Republicans. They just can't be too Republican-y. It's fine to hire Republicans, but they can't support Republicans. And the backstory here that I find interesting, when MSNBC hired Jen Psaki, a very similar kind of hire, right? When MSNBC hired Jen Psaki, here was the headline on a CNN piece: NBC News journalist vexed by MSNBC's move to hire White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. And the journalists at NBC tutted MSNBC for hiring a mouthpiece. For Noah Oppenheim, the NBC News president even held an impromptu phone call so that he could address the matter with vexed staffers at the Washington Bureau, some of whom have complained to their superiors that tentative hiring tarnishes the NBC News brand.
And by the way, she has a show.
Yeah.
A primetime show.
But so part of this is driven by an office politics, internal dynamics. So NBC News looks down its nose at MSNBC for understandable reasons, right? NBC News is a impressive global, it's America's leading television news. Lester Holt is.
Okay, Nicole.
No, I'm saying NBC News looks at MSNBC askance for a reason, right? Because MSNBC is intensely and intentionally partisan and blah, 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 blah. So this was a chance for MSNBC to pay back NBC News, right? Like, oh, are we allowed to publicly voice our vexation with the other part of our corporate siblings' misconduct in hiring? Oh, okay, well, we can do this. And then, of course, they loved it so much. Once they got to start doing it, they loved it so much because it was a chance for everybody to demonstrate to their audience, and this is a great example of how audience capture works. MSNBC, it felt so good to get to say to their loyal viewers, we would never tolerate this. We'll never have this. We'll never allow it. And it felt so good, so they all just took a turn doing it. And I saw here the same thing that we saw at the New York Times, that we've seen at the Washington Post, and that we've seen at a lot of other places. I would not have hired Ronna Romney McDaniel, right? If I was the head of NBC News, I wouldn't have hired her simply for the fact that what do you get, right? She's not having a person.
You're making my point. She's not good.
Having a person, you can hire contributors for access, which is kind of icky but understandable. But she doesn't have access because she's been banished and exiled by the Trump people. Or you can hire them. You know who I love? Claire McCaskill. You know why I love Claire McCaskill? She's a former Democratic senator, and she has interesting stuff to say when she comes on television. She goes on MSNBC. I don't agree with her all the time, but she has interesting stuff to say. At News Nation, I love Mick Mulvaney. You know why I love Mick Mulvaney? He worked in the Trump White House. He worked in the Trump administration. He was in Congress, but he's an interesting analyst with all of this experience. Paying someone, here's how I will put it. Paying someone to be a reliable mouthpiece for a political party is not a good use of money. Just book people from the party, right? You don't need to hire the former. You can just book the person from the party to come on and tell you what the party line is. So I wouldn't have hired her. I get it. But neither would I have engaged in the kind of solipsistic, self-seeking, glory-hogging, ball-hogging, preposterous behavior that these people on MSNBC did. If you have a complaint about the way that, and it's not even your company, right? The way that somebody in another division of your company is operating, there are ways to do it and there are ways not to do it, and this was juvenile beyond juvenile.
Well, I don't totally agree with your point about MSNBC tutting NBC, in that Chuck Todd of NBC, who has his own issues with MSNBC, led the charge in all of this.
Well, that's what made it sad.
And
invited back on the show that you got fired from to come on the panel and say, and to try to white knight it, it's a little rich. And my thing for Todd is doing that. The people who drove him out of his job, right? The activated, very online left that believed that Chuck Todd was a stalking horse for MAGA America or something. I don't think they're going to warm up to him. I don't think that him having done this, they're going to say, now we like Chuck Todd.
And beyond that, so MSNBC and NBC were united in their objection to having Ronna Romney McDaniel on. And then they're all saying, it's not that we object to Republicans, it's that we object to Ronna Romney McDaniel because she was towing the Trump line on all of this. Well, hello, guys. You know, the Republican Party is the Trump party. And to the extent you want a faithful representative of the current Republican Party on your airwaves, they are going to be doing this. Exactly. And so I had a very interesting conversation with somebody last night, a well-known journalist, who said, you know, I do think they had to draw a line and this is beyond the pale. And I think that is a debate you can have. But to the extent you want an actual representative of where the party is and you want to expose viewers to that, you're going to have to expose them to people who are going to agree with Trump when he says things that are beyond the pale.
Right. Well, this is right on the money for the Wretch audience, which is the piece that Brian Gallagher wrote for the New York Times, Fast Food Forever, How McHaters Lost the Culture War. And it's a business story that tracks McDonald's astonishing success after a period of time around the turn of the century when it seemed like maybe they were going down. Now, this has particular resonance for me because they twig off of the movie Super Size Me. Do you remember the movie Super Size Me?
Of course.
Okay, so Morgan Spurlock is also a West Virginian, and he achieved astonishing success with this documentary that he made, and it was popular because it was in the zeitgeist, but also because it was at a time when low-budget indie kind of Michael Moore stuff was really hitting, right? And it was, as filmmaking got cheaper and a lot of stuff. And the premise of the movie was that Morgan Spurlock ate only McDonald's for a month and went to the doctor and they said, you're going to die. And it was, of course, malarkey, right? The idea that anybody would say, I can go to any restaurant, but particularly a hamburger stand, and eat anything I want. And part of the gimmick was anytime they asked him if he wanted to supersize it, he did it. So whatever he wanted, he had to do whatever the clown told him. Whatever corporate food told him he had to do it. He couldn't just get the salad. And he gained all this weight and his triglycerides went up and it was this thing. And so there was a moment in the culture that the Times piece very helpfully lays out about McDonald's became synonymous in the early 21st century mode. McDonald's became the story of everything that was wrong with America, right? McJobs, McMansions, it's bad for you. It became a shameful thing. It became like smoking cigarettes. And people have written about this, that it became a shameful thing for college education, for the broad elite, for the top 2 quintiles of the American public to say that you went to McDonald's. It was like saying that you had just smoked a pack of Cools. And how this piece very helpfully breaks down what McDonald's did with the threat. And it was really good advice, which was at the beginning, they were looking for ways to rebut the claims that Morgan Spurlock and their critics were making. What are we going to do about these claims to emphasize that we're healthy? And they talked to the advertising agency that counseled McDonald's, and they said, don't listen to the haters.
No, you cannot play defense.
Don't play defense.
No way.
Find the people who love you, right? This is a podcast in which we have consumed a grimace shake on camera. We have had a McRib tasting. What McDonald's did was lean into its brand and who it was. And the concept, the secret sauce about McDonald's is wherever you go in America or wherever you go in the world, there will be a McDonald's there, and it will be consistent. Now, there are bad McDonald's. It's not Burger King like inconsistent, but there are bad McDonald's, no question. Some are better than others, but generally speaking, anywhere you go in the world, from a truck stop in Nagadocious to Spain, if you find a McDonald's, you know what it's going to be there, and you know that you can get and I'm going to say it, nourishing, nutritious meal consistently at these places. And they won the battle. And this is it's a fascinating piece. And when we think about what is the American brand, instead of being ashamed that America is associated with McDonald's, Americans should feel good that so many people around the world have been fed and satisfied by McDonald's. And no, Morgan Spurlock, you cannot have a grimace shake 3 times a day and 3 large fries.
And all the pictures look so good.
I know.
Oh, they really look awesome. So let's talk about you then joined CNN as a commentator. Why do you think that they didn't exactly cover themselves in glory in the Trump years? I would not say they're covering themselves in glory now. I was a contributor at CNN during the couple of the Trump years. We do CNN together from time to time now. But why did you think that in terms of being a paid contributor, it was less objectionable to, to you?
Well,
to join up with them.
So first of all, I agree with you. CNN did not cover itself in glory during the Trump years. I think CNN is aware of this and is trying to get better. It is not following the MSNBC model. I will say that. That said, it's probably best I don't get too deep in the weeds on all that stuff. But part of it was, at CNN, I could be more of my whole self. I could, at Fox, literally, it's not like people were yelling in my ear through the IFB, don't talk about Trump. It was that the topic selection was always such that I was never given the opportunity to talk about Trump. And so I felt like I was complicit in this idea where I come, halfway in a show between a wildly pro-Trump interview and right before another wildly pro-Trump interview, and people just think, oh, I'm part of that general parade of pro-Trump people. And it's really funny. I Howie Kurtz, who does that media show, a rival media criticism product to this fine podcast.
No. We're beneath contempt. We're just wretches.
And Howie wanted me to come on and talk about the left's cancel culture stuff. And I can't even remember what the news hook for it was. And I made the point. You can find it on YouTube. I made the point that the left has a real cancel culture problem. So does the right. The current president of the United States loves canceling people. And Howie, you could almost hear, despite its distance from his microphone, the sudden onset emptying of his bowels as he's like, "Oh crap, we're going to get Trump criticism here."
We thought we had constructed the cage to hold Jonah, and he has reached a paw out and unlatched it.
So anyway, at CNN, I will say this: it is very difficult for people to understand what kind of creature I am at CNN, because I will say bad things about Donald Trump, and then I will say bad things about Joe Biden.
Yeah.
I will say Donald Trump is completely guilty of the things that he's basically being accused of in the Alvin Bragg case, and the Alvin Bragg case is garbage. And this is part of the problems with cable news environment generally, is that, and this gets to my point about the corruption that comes from thinking if you're a conservative, your job is to always defend Republicans, or if thinking if you're a liberal, your job is to always defend Democrats, is the conflation of party operative people with journalists. And so the anatomy, the way cable news works is if it's a Democrat in the White House, we'll bring on conservatives to criticize the president. If it's a Republican in the White House, we'll bring on liberals to criticize the president. And you're often put, I'm sure both of you have had this experience, where you're put on sometimes on a panel where the person you're supposed to argue with is an outright paid flack of the Democratic Party. And so they will take whatever position is the position du jour because they are doing client work. And then you're stuck in this position where you have to either, if you make any concession, well, I think George Bush made a mistake with that speech. Even Jonah agrees that George Bush is a fascist, right?
Yeah.
And so it sticks you in this rhetorical trap. And I think the beginning of this problem, actually the beginning of the problem, the best sort of illustrative chapter of this was, remember the Jon Stewart on Crossfire stuff?
Yes.
We reference it frequently here.
So like Bob Novak, I have big problems with Bob Novak, departed Bob Novak. But Bob Novak actually believed in some things. Some of them, he was a very anti-Israel guy. I think really problematically so.
Oh, I forgot about that. I forgot.
When we were pitching the Dispatch, we used to say, and Steve's going to do a reported column, sort of like Bob Novak without the anti-Semitism. But like they brought on Carville and Begala, who in this current climate, they're charming guys. Begala in particular, I've become friendly with. But their job was just to be party hacks.
Yeah.
And Novak wouldn't take positions that he didn't actually believe. And there was this mismatch. And that's what they like in cable news. And so, like, I kind of enjoy being the skunk at the garden party where they put me on panels sometimes with pro-Trump people and anti-Trump people. And I'm like, he's 50% right and she's 50% right, which is another way of saying she's 50% wrong and he's 50% wrong. And I get to be my whole self. I don't take TV all that seriously anymore. I used to think it was really cool to be on TV. I think it's important for the Dispatch. It's important for business reasons. It's good to be paid to do it because if you feel like you have to do it anyway, it's better to be compensated for it. But my happiest days, and no one at CNN will, if you wanted to go deep dive reporting on this, you'll get nothing but confirmation. My happiest days are when I get bumped and don't have to go on to TV. I really just, I don't hate it, but I don't love driving across town to talk for 4 minutes and then, have to come home.
The Washington Post, though, is
my gosh,
is rising to the challenge. Why scientists fear a second Trump term and what they're doing about it. And Colin rightly put this in the facile file this week. He manned up and he put it in the facile file. I put it up here because it lives in campaign coverage, because I think it speaks to the all-hands-on-deck approach that is going on about trying to convince people of the urgency of preventing Donald Trump from winning re-election. And what made it facile, though, the headline, why scientists fear a second Trump term. All scientists? Does every scientist in the country? Are they all united in fear about a Donald Trump presidency? And then they give it away right in the lead.
It's amazing.
In the lead.
And the fact that this comes, the lead is about an EPA union.
When the union,
this
is how they begin.
When
scientists. The union representing nearly half of Environmental Protection Agency employees approved a new contract with the federal government last month. It included an unusual provision that had nothing to do with pay, benefits, or workplace flexibility, protections from political meddling into their work. I wonder how the union representing half of the EPA is voting.
Also, to have this come in the shadow of the errors, lies, etc., of institutionalized science, quote unquote, in this country, where those people were employed by the government, and to still act like these people represent science, like, come on, and make no caveat that like this has become politicized.
Well, this is scientism, right? This is the religion of science. And if you say scientists are worried, and look, it's not without concern, right? It's not without concern that Donald Trump administration will ride roughshod. If I was a climate change scientist at the EPA, I would definitely want Joe Biden to win the election for sure, and I would be concerned. But the framing here is that scientists, that the world of science fears Donald Trump. I would say it's probably that progressive or liberal or democratic members of that community are concerned, and boo.
Amazing. Mine is a story that is really TLDR, so it took me like all day on Saturday to read this story because I was getting up and down and dealing with my kid and whatever. But it is a great New York Times Magazine piece. The headline is Ibram X. Kendi faces a reckoning of his own. In 2020, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist galvanized Americans with his ideas. The past 4 years have tested them and him, and it is by an editor for the Times Magazine named Rachel Poser, and
What?
Rachel Poser, Poser, and the magazine notes she spoke to Kendi over a period of several months and visited him at his research center in Boston, and the center, of course, laid off dozens of people, and the fundraising has completely dried up after they got I think $10 million from Jack Dorsey and these huge corporate donations. And it is really good in that it's not just totally hostile to him. It really entertains him and his ideas, and yet she talks to people who lodged complaints against him or quit, who of course were sympathetic. They came to work for him, and portrays him as totally and completely paranoid. He's very, very secretive. And then his accusation, any complaint raised against him, he says, well, that's racist. That implies that they haven't done the work.
Yeah.
And so basically she, through interviewing him, reveals that you can't actually criticize him or bring to him a complaint. So she writes, he was far from the only nonprofit leader caught short as funding for racial justice work collapsed after 2020. And the center had gone from raising $40 million in 2020 to a fraction of that, $420,000 the next year. By the time the academic year began in the fall of 2021, Kendi decided to take extraordinary measures. Before the center began in-person work that September, Kendi sent the staff an email about, quote, security protocols, instructing them to conceal the location of the center even from other Boston University faculty members and students. It is critical not to share the address of the center with anyone or bring anyone into the center, Kendi wrote. The email included a mock script to be used in the event of an inquiry about the center's location, which ended abruptly with, I gotta go. So they talk about how paranoid and secretive he is, and that people in charge of funding for the center, he wouldn't share the books with them. The one question I will say that is not answered in this is, where did the $40 million go?
Yeah.
And it left me wondering about that, but it's a very, very good piece.
People gave money to him. And what was her name?
Robin DiAngelo.
Robin DiAngelo.
Talks about her too, and that they were paired together, but they have different ideas. She basically, yeah.
The money that went to Kendi and DiAngelo was the buying of indulgences. If you read John McWhorter's book about, I think it's called Woke Racism, I forget what it's called, but it talks about the religious nature of anti-racism. And in keeping with the religious tone, the Reformation of Christianity had many causes and many consequences, but a core one was of the selling of indulgences, right? That the church was allowing people to pay to get time off their purgatory stays and be admitted to the kingdom of heaven. And what Kendi and DiAngelo were offering was, if you pay us, if you buy the book, if you have us come lecture, if you contribute to the center, you will atone for some of your whiteness. You will atone for some of your racism. And in a surprise move, 3 years later, it didn't work, right? It didn't. This is a good piece because it confronts the fact that racism will not be banished. We will never undo racism. It will never come to pass. We should try to ameliorate its consequences. We should think about those things ourselves. But the idea that here's what it is. Whenever they talk about we're having a moment, right, it suggests that, and then after this, human nature will be different. Human nature will not be different after this. And if you give Ibram X. Kendi $40 million and you stock his anti-racist baby book in your bookstore, you will not change human nature. In fact, human nature will assert itself when secretive, famous people lose $40 million of the money that was given to them.
Yeah, I highly recommend the piece. Barton Swaim in the Journal had a column about the CNN piece that commented on White House reporters and their regrets, which I thought was great. So he wrote in a piece on CNN's website gently asking if the White House press corps dropped the ball on fully covering Biden's limitations. Reporter Hadass Gold can't help defending her tribe. Like all past presidents, she writes, Biden has good days and bad days. And we've seen that line in the New York Times and elsewhere. It can be tricky to report on something as difficult to define as a person aging when his opponent is a convicted felon who regularly lies and has threatened to use the government to go after his political opponents. And Swaim writes, every part of this paragraph is laughable. It's false that all presidents have good days and have good and bad days in the way Mr. Biden has them. It isn't tricky to report on a person aging if that person is the president of the United States. Mr. Trump's conviction for falsifying business records in furtherance of an unnamed separate crime isn't the reason Ms. Gold and most journalists and Democrats are desperate to keep him from regaining the presidency. Mr. Biden also lies with some regularity, and it's rather amazing, is it not, to think that journalists would be so worried about a president going after his political opponent that they would shade the truth for another president who goes after his political opponent.
Exactly.
And then he says, what I object to most about Ms. Gold's aside, though, is the premise. Most of the press has been studiously incurious about Mr. Biden's diminished state since the 2020 campaign, long before Mr. Trump seemed likely to be his opponent in the 2024 election, and even before Mr. Biden was the 2020 nominee.
Yes, the incuriosity is an important point because it's not just that people have political bias. It's the choice of how to frame a story. But most importantly, it's the choice of whether to investigate and report something at all, right? You know this. I mean, what you choose to look at and examine deeply matters. And so by willfully saying this is not something that's seemly for us. And I remember that at the very beginning, people sort of like, this is ageism. I think now people are saying this is ableism and ageism to even ask these questions. This is a kind of desperate attempt.
Why should we have an able president?
Right. Why not?
Crazy.
He can, this is well beyond what we need. But that part of it strikes me as going to the heart of a lot of the rot in mainstream media right now, and it's been exposed. It's like the dry rot in a house where it can look like the house is in one piece, but you can punch your fist right through the wall and everything around it crumbles. And they know this. They're aware of this now. So I think that's why you are seeing a lot of revisionist history in the immediate aftermath of the debate by journalists. But going forward, they should be tough. I was always glad when the press corps was tough on a Republican president because that's their, as you said at the top of the show, that is their job. But I think the protective bubble that Biden has had, again, I don't believe that they haven't seen this with their own eyes. They have seen it. They didn't want to believe it. And as you point to, politically, it was useful not to believe it until now.
This is why I think it's useful to have ideologically diverse media outlets because, we at the Beacon, we know that the mainstream media, every day they wake up wanting to cover Republicans. And for the past 4 years, 75% of the headlines, if you read Politico Playbook, every day the headline is about Trump,
right?
Who's not the president. Like, it was so hard to be like, could you guys cover
the
Biden presidency? Like the people actually in power. And I think it is useful for the people who like really feel it in their kishkas about the other guys. And it demonstrates, I think, why it's so important. And what we saw with Biden is these people don't feel that way about the Biden presidency.
No.
They don't have the same desire to ferret out the truth, hold these guys accountable. But it does speak to, I think, to the uses and the public good of having a, ideologically diverse media outlets.
Well, and one of the moments that I think historians of this era will look back on is the Her report was sort of the first. I saw that as the first crack in the dam, because a lot of the instant response, this was the report where, the transcript couldn't be released because, and Her said, I'm not going to prosecute further because the president is a sort of old man who can't quite,
that a jury would view him as a well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory.
Exactly. That, besides being perfect T-shirt swag opportunity for the Trump campaign, if Joe Biden stays in, was actually, it showed that he was trying to do his job, right? He has prosecutorial discretion. He used that judgment, used that discretion to say, look, there's some stuff here, but I wouldn't be able to get a conviction. The media isn't exercising its judgment and discretion in the same way. And that was revealed when Her did this. He was tarred as a right-winger, which is kind of crazy. And he's owed an apology. He really is, because he did his job well. He got absolutely pummeled for it in the press. And he was unfortunately proven correct.
My friend Jay Caruso did the math. He looked at the print edition of the Washington Post on July 24th, and there were 10 different articles about Harris, none of them critical, 3 of which were in the style section. The relief, the wave of relief in the press that Kamala Harris is in and Joe Biden is out, and I can only compare it to one thing, which is what happened when Hillary Clinton was dethroned as the Democratic front runner in 2008. The Obama vibes are real. The enthusiasm to be rid of this unpopular figure from the old Democratic era and replaced with a new, diverse, interesting, different person. It is a wave of relief, and it manifests itself in this kind of coverage.
There's a real effort to turn her into a cultural figure.
I'm sorry, I just
icon.
fell out of a coconut tree. I don't have any context for...
Which we're seeing with all this creation of these memes, which, fine. But then the coverage of them in the press, and the press playing into the effort to turn her into this hip cultural icon, which we also got in 2020, where there was coverage of her Converse shoes and how cool and fun she was to go shopping with. And now we're seeing it really in overdrive. And I think the real question is, will this persist through November? Or will the press start covering her critically?
Can she be as good as Obama? She wasn't in 2020. Barack Obama, whatever anybody thinks of Barack Obama, his gifts as a communicator were real, right? He was good. He could do the interviews. Now, they were favorable interviews. But what about Eugene Daniels?
President of the White House Correspondents Association. This relates to
the
many left-wingers and then some members of the press piling on to Brian Kilmeade, who was criticizing Kamala Harris's decision not to attend the Netanyahu speech and said she'd rather address a college sorority, where she was speaking at a college sorority. And he said in a tweet that Kilmeade had said she'd rather address a colored sorority, and oh my gosh, how racist this is. And that went everywhere.
And the header on his Twitter profile is him interviewing Kamala Harris, and his pinned tweet is an interview that he did with Kamala Harris. Now, I understand it's a big get, but you're the president of the White House Correspondents Association. Maybe be cool. Maybe relax about this stuff.
This somebody mentioned to me yesterday that the coverage here, it reads more, and it's been for a long time, particularly his coverage in Playbook, reads more like he writes Politico Playbook in addition to being president of the White House Correspondents Association. Now, it reads more like rapid response for Kamala Harris than it does as a reportorial.
Let's listen to what Brian Kilmeade said.
Sat down for an interview. When she sits down in an interview and says, do you want to fund ICE? Where do you stand on Medicare for all? Why didn't you show up? The most recent decision, already you got a question. She will not show up for the Prime Minister's joint session of Congress today. She'd rather address in the summer a sorority, a college sorority, like she can't get out of that. So that's her decision, and that's her decision to back up the protesters.
And how about the border? When they ask her about the border, I haven't been to Europe either. Remember, she said that she's the border czar. She didn't go to the president. She didn't go to the border, and now we're learning that two of the border chiefs, the last two border chiefs, she hasn't talked to.
Now, I'm not saying that a person couldn't have heard that wrong, that his Long Island accent combined with speaking rapidly, that you could have heard it wrong. But how could you tweet the accusation without checking? If you are the president of the White House Correspondents Association, how is it possible that you would not say, wow, before I accuse someone of using the word colored to describe Kamala Harris's sorority, I should be very sure about this. And he did not, which is irresponsible. But here's another crotchety old man point that I will make.
Well, can we note that he then deleted the tweet?
Yes.
And said, I spoke to Fox News about this and plan on speaking to Brian when he is off air. They made clear to me that he used college, not color. The audio is garbled, but I'm going to take Brian and his team at their word.
At their word.
How about I'm sorry?
How about I'm sorry? How about I'm sorry? And the crotchety old man answer is, you have a job to work for Politico. Put it through Politico. Stop tweeting everything. Stop racing to get out the next tweet so that you can have the tweet that gets ahead of the whatever. Take a breath. You have a job. You have an editor. You exist in the context of all that has been before you. So why don't you use that instead of getting your thirsty tweet out on the internet as soon as possible so that you get to be the first one to say that you did it? And boo. I know Brian Kilmeade. Brian Kilmeade, you can disagree with Brian Kilmeade, but his track record would be clear that he does not seem like a person who would use that word to describe a black sorority. Were you surprised by the debate?
That's a good question.
Oh.
I'm not sure.
Oh.
I think I really didn't know what to expect.
I think
with Trump, you never have any idea what to expect. And with Harris, she sort of overperformed my expectations. I thought that the anchors, it was a scandal how incredibly biased the anchors were. And I saw a tweet from CNN's Abby Phillips saying, if one candidate, if the lies are asymmetrical, the fact-checking will be asymmetrical. Okay, I take that point. But is it her view that one candidate said nothing that was untrue?
Right.
Because Trump was fact-checked several times and Harris was fact-checked 0 times.
0 times.
Including when she said that there are no American troops in combat zones, in active combat anywhere in the world. But a couple thoughts on that, because I take the point that, if you're pointing this out, you're losing.
Right.
Harris won. She did better. She was prepared. And the moderators were biased. I thought that the moderators sort of shored her up when she was nervous at first. And she sort of saw how things were playing out, that they were going to fact check him, that everything was going to be okay. And she gained confidence as the evening went on, and he got off kilter. I also thought that Trump, having agreed to a debate on ABC, who's the co-president of the Disney Entertainment Group, is Kamala Harris's best friend, Dana Walden. And we're told, okay, she had no input into how this debate was done, but at the end of the day, she's the boss of the boss of the boss of David Moyer.
Right.
And of course they don't want to piss this person off. he should have understood, having agreed to this debate and showed up there, that this was something like this was likely to happen.
He had been
and
complaining about it. He had been complaining about ABC's bias for months.
Yes, and he's in a lawsuit.
Yes.
Against George Stephanopoulos.
Yes.
That is going to trial, or a judge has green-lighted it to go to trial for Stephanopoulos saying that Trump was found liable for rape.
Right.
And he should have been prepared with a line to deploy from the stage. Recall when Newt Gingrich did this.
Right.
And
I recall.
It was electric, right?
I recall.
And so Trump
poor Juan Williams
didn't do that. And I thought that was a loss. And it's interesting because one of the things I flagged to talk about was that he then went on Fox and Friends and he had some kind of funny lines about like ABC should be shut down. They're totally dishonest. Well, dude, why didn't you say it from the stage? Like when they fact-checked her, or when they fact-checked him, why didn't he say, are you guys ever going to fact-check her?
Right.
Is everything she's saying true? And so, he kind of got what he had coming. We have this incredible profile. The headline is The Endless Downfall of a Crypto Power Couple. And
what a
it
story.
Is about the former FTX executive, Ryan Salem, and the crypto policy advocate, Michelle Bond, who was also a Republican congressional candidate, and about how they are living. He's on the precipice of going to prison, and she's got a legal case against her. His is for campaign finance violations, where he was convicted of straw donations. And the Times writes, it's amazing. And there's pictures of them in their $4 million home in Potomac that is going to be sold, and the money given to victims of FTX's fraud. And Salem he's very angry at his attorneys he pled guilty. And he says that he shouldn't have pled guilty. He didn't do anything wrong. He now wants to go to law school to learn the law because he wished he could have defended himself. And so the Times writes, this tale of crypto boy meets crypto girl has turned into a legal nightmare. Mr. Salem, 31, once a top lieutenant to Mr. Bankman-Fried, is set to report to federal prison in Maryland on Friday to start a sentence of 7.5 years after he pleaded guilty to campaign finance fraud. In August, Miss Bond, 45, who lives with Mr. Salem and their infant son in Potomac, was also charged with campaign finance violations linked to FTX. And one of the interesting aspects is that Salem hired Bond to be a consultant to FTX while she was running for Congress. And she got a $400,000 signing bonus to the company and then a $100,000 a year salary. And I think the prosecutors are arguing that that was actually a contribution to her campaign that was disguised. So it says around the time, that comes next. So around the time Ms. Bond started her campaign in May, Mr. Salem instructed an FTX colleague to create a consulting agreement for her, $100,000 a year plus a $400,000 signing bonus, according to prosecutors. When the employee asked who would oversee Ms. Bond's work for the company, Mr. Salem responded, me. Ms. Bond spent the money on her congressional campaign, the prosecutor said. She lost the Republican primary in August 2022, collecting only 27% of the vote.
It's
a great piece.
It's a great piece. And its author, the writer, is David Yoth Bellany, did a great job. It's packed with details, but still a compelling story about two people who, I will say, when you hear about them, they seem like contemptible figures. And then you read it and you see that it's a story as old as time, right? When there are booms going on, people start to believe the impossible and will preserve that fiction at great, great cost. It's a very good, very compelling read.
It's great. Well, that breaks.
He could use some tips on dressing, but I will,
Which one? Salem?
Yeah.
What's your beef?
I don't know. It's just children's clothes.
Oh yeah, the shirt I'm not into. Oh, the belt's bad.
It's just children's clothes. You're doing an interview with the New York Times.
It's bad.
Don't dress like a child. And that was the news about the news for the year 2024. We hope you enjoyed it. Certainly, I know I speak for Eliana. when I say we enjoyed hanging out with you in 2024, and we are very much looking forward to being with you in 2025. If you have any story that you want us to talk about, email us at wretches@nebulouspodcast.com and sign up for our newsletter at nebulouspodcast.com. This has been the 2024 wrap-up show of Ink-Stained Wretches from Nebulous Media, produced by the aforementioned Colin Chicola. Find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Just search for Wretches. Happy New Year.